of shows. Available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we're going to be talking about another team that potentially underperformed, exceeded expectations, so to speak, the Green Bay Packers. Another team, much like Houston in the AFC, that was thinking about becoming an elite Super Bowl contender in the NFC, but ultimately were in the toughest division this year and really didn't establish themselves against the elite teams. They ultimately had a decent defense, but because they were too reliant on the takeaway, the pass rush never fully rounded into form, and that was a big issue. On the offensive side of the football, Jordan Love still played at the elite level. We remember him towards the end of the season after he came back from injury problems, but ultimately did not do enough, and they came up short against a much superior Philadelphia Eagles team in the wild card round. But I do think that this was a learning year for the Packers, that you really need to continue to address this team. You can't just stand pat, much like what I think they did last offseason in terms of this offense. Obviously, the defense, I do have worries for it too, but I think the offense, it's more about, the fact that they have too many receivers who could profile on any given day as their number one receiver and not enough winners. And I think they need a receiver. They could definitely be a shock team in the Cooper Cup sweepstakes, but that's a big problem. Also a big problem is finding out the best positions for their offensive line. And the defensive end, you did a great job building up the secondary, one of the best secondaries in the NFL in terms of generating takeaways. But then this pass rush really floundered. It had bright moments throughout the season, but it really floundered when it mattered most. So without further ado, let's talk about how this Packers team can learn from this year and better address certain needs in this offseason. Starting off, I believe, with this defense, which is a little bit more prescient. I do think that you need to continue to find more pass rush because you don't necessarily blitz a lot. Jeff Hafley had one of the lowest blitz rates for his defense in the NFL this year. And I do think that you need to find ways to consistently pressure the quarterback. There were moments against the Eagles that they were able to, but not enough moments because of what the Eagles can do to you in the run game as well. But ultimately, I just don't necessarily think you can continue to build up your secondary and ignore your pass rush. And the draft is definitely a very deep place to address it. You may want to address other positions of need in the draft as well, but I do think that there could be a lot of interesting pass rush options, maybe not the best options, but potentially guys that could blossom into decent enough 3-down players for you down the line. But I do think that in terms of the offense, we always talk about this receiving group, not necessarily saying there's a star player amongst them, but saying how because of that depth, you really are challenged by them. Well, I do think that it's time to get aggressive in that department if I'm Green Bay. Going out there and signing a guy like Cooper Kupp will be huge for this team, even though he kind of fits into the mold of what the Packers like at the receiver position. He's way more than, say, what Romeo Doubs or, say, Jayden Reed can give you, because he's a little bit more elite in how he's adapted to the NFL throughout his career. So I would not be surprised if the Green Bay Packers are an intriguing player in the Cooper Cup sweepstakes, just because they might want a little bit more diversity and experience in their wide receiving core. But let's talk about this offensive line, because it's an interesting area. Not necessarily because it's lacking in any one department. It's more about how to figure out all these elite linemen's positions, especially a guy like Jordan Morgan, your first-round pick last year. And he only played 186 snaps because of a shoulder injury last year. But while he was playing, he was primarily at a guard spot. He views himself as a tackle, But Zach Tom and Rasheed Walker are pretty elite in their own rights at those positions. So it could be a conundrum that makes it a little bit weird for the interior of this offensive line and might add to questions about how they line up. And it's why right now they're a little bit apprehensive in wanting to re-sign their center, Josh Myers, because they don't necessarily want to waste Morgan anywhere, and they certainly don't want to stick him in a position that he might be uncomfortable with throughout the entirety of his NFL career. So they could have some movement along this line as the offseason goes on, whether it be, releasing a guy like Myers, taking a chance on someone in the draft. You could see a lot of movement on this offensive line as well. But if I were the Packers GM, I would want a little bit more receiving help, and then the offensive line will, for lack of a better term, fall into line, no pun intended, by itself. But then, here's what I think the Packers are going to do in terms of the draft, because the draft could be very interesting, especially for this Packers squad, because you feel like you have the important things addressed, your O-line, your secondary, but there are never certain places where you feel too confident. And that's why, even though one of the big primary priorities this Packers team has going on in the offseason is finding pass rush, I would not be surprised if cornerback stands out for them as a potential need. Eric Stokes is a free agent, and he never really was a good Packer to begin with. Jair Alexander is someone who is always going to be seen as an elite cover corner, but is often injured. So I could see the Packers surprising everyone, not necessarily addressing the pass rush in the draft, potentially taking risks in free agency, but ultimately going with a cornerback spot and trying to get younger at the position. But in terms of the cornerback spot, I do think that this could be the most prolific position in this year's draft class because of the versatility of a lot of these guys. For example, a guy I'm all familiar with as a Texas Longhorns fan, Jahdae Barron. Very elite in whatever you need him to do. He can help in run support, elite in coverage, loves playing man-to-man, not afraid to be a vocal leader in any given system. So he could be an interesting option. Trey Amos as well. Very instinctual. More so in terms of ball skills over Jahdae Barron, I would say. But still very elite in his own right. Gives you a little bit more of a cover guy who relies on his instincts to get the job done. But I do think that there could be many options for Green Bay in this year's draft. I do think that not many defensive linemen would be around where the Packers want to pick, and it could be a situation where they're picking the best area of need, or more so, best player available, so to speak. But I do think that in terms of improvement, there are many ways and many avenues the Packers can address their defense, just because, the corner situation might get a little bit shaky, but you also want to keep in mind what should be your top priority, which is pass rush. But then, I do think going back to this offense, if, you're not necessarily in on the Cooper Kupp situation, then you could be in on guys like T. Higgins and Garrett Wilson, potentially, who are in the final years of their deals and might be frustrated with how their contract situations are planned out with their respective teams that you could be in on. T. Higgins is going to be a very hot commodity, and I feel like if the Packers were to try and trade for him rather than just wait for him, I think they could send over a decent enough package with a guy like Romeo Doubs, who is an underrated receiver from their roster in his own right, to the Bengals, and that would be a happy kind of situation for both teams, win-win for both of those teams. But I do think that ultimately there are a lot of frustrated wide receivers, like guys like Garrett Wilson, and saddeningly for me, a guy like DK Metcalf potentially, who could pop up in free agency as well that the Packers could take advantage of and could be able to send a nice deal and a package to that team in return. But I do think that first and foremost, you're going to have to decide who to part with in this very deep receiving room. Because Dobbs could be a popular option, but I do think that he proved to be a very, very valuable asset down the stretch for this Packers team. And looking at the tenor of this receiving core, no one has performed badly to the extent where you would be completely comfortable sending them away in a package. And that's the unique nature of this Packers receiving unit that puts you in a bind in terms of going out and getting a true wide receiver one that wins matchups consistently. So I feel like the Packers can address this situation, but how they go about it and who they decide leaves is going to come down to who you value. And if it's a guy like T. Higgins or Kupp in the market, then you have an opportunity to offer them the best package. But you have to make sure that you're comfortable with sending away certain assets just because of the depth of that receiving room, if you get what I'm saying. But overall, if I'm looking at the Packers heading into the offseason, it's not necessarily too many issues to worry about. It's more so about bolstering this pass rush, which is probably the hardest thing to do, because in the draft, I don't necessarily think there's one guy who immediately is going to show up and show out. James Pierce was expected to be a very nice high motor guy, but now his draft stock seems to be falling. So I don't necessarily know what direction the Packers go in the draft if they want to go defensively. But then the offensive line situation is just a matter of positioning. It's a matter of comfortability for all of these guys and finding a fit for Jordan Morgan because you want to invest in him as one of your youngest O-linemen. And then obviously the receiving core is not necessarily the most pressing issue, but it is one that I'm really intrigued to see how they handle just because. But let me know what you think in the comments below about this Packers team, because coming next we transition to our final team we're going to be talking about in terms of offseason guys, our final NFC North team. We're going to be talking about the Minnesota Vikings and all the chaos that can ensue with them. We'll be right back after this short break to discuss them as well.